You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Zach Bechtold and Matt Franks. We hope you enjoyed today's podcast and check us out online at beardedtheologians.com. You're listening to the Bearded Theologians podcast, hosted by Matt Franks
and Zach Bechtold.
This week on the Bearded Theologians, we're going to take another lectionary approach, and we're looking at the Gospel of Mark, chapter 2, verses 23 through 28, and maybe even we might dive a little bit into chapter 3 because that's part of the lectionary reading today. So, Zach, as you read this scripture and you see that Jesus is walking through a wheat field and the Pharisees are questioning Jesus's Sabbath policies, and as you read this, what are some things that kind of come to mind for you?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind for me is what we get hung up on here. And I guess when I say we, the Pharisees, what the Pharisees get hung up on. The Sabbath day is the day that they took off. They couldn't work. They couldn't do anything. They had to prepare before. And Jesus is walking through this field with the disciples, and they're hungry. And so they shake some wheat off and eat. And the Pharisees are like, look, you're breaking the law. You're working. And Jesus is like, we got to eat, right? You know, what's more important here, I think, is the underlying tone. And for me, that's just kind of where I go when we get hung up on stuff so easily that's not, that may seem important at the time, but when we look back at it, it's not that important, right? We're getting hung up on the wrong things, and we're telling people, oh, you can't do this, this, and this, when they're going, we're hungry, we're tired, we need to do this in these moments. But we as people, as the church, as whatever, are looking at it going, no, you can't do this because we say, you know, this is what this says, whether it's the law, it's scripture, it's this or that, it doesn't really matter. If it's our own personal rules or whatever it is, we say, no, you can't do that because this says so. And people are going, yeah, but we're hungry. Yeah, but we're this. We need to do this to survive. And I think we get hung up on that legalism, and it doesn't allow us to see people for who they are. And that's kind of what I see in this bit of scripture, especially getting into chapter 3 with healing.
Well, I found it interesting. There's some really great dialogue about this on Working Preachers podcast this week that dealt with that. That really looked at, talked about the practice of Sabbath, and that one of the part of the practices of Sabbath, if I remember correctly, I may be wrong, and if I'm wrong, please go listen to that podcast and correct me. But they talked about part of the reason for the Sabbath in Deuteronomy 5 was to remember the slavery that they were in, and to have reverence towards God, you know, that helped free them and liberate them from slavery. And then also the whole idea of rest and centering ourselves upon God. And I think that when we look up at this, you've got these two stories. These two stories that are looking at, one, you've got these religious leaders that are questioning Jesus on whether what he's doing is right. And Jesus pointing out to the fact that, hey, you know, we got to eat.
Right.
You know, the Sabbath doesn't say don't eat. You know, if it'd be different if the Sabbath actually said fast. I think there'd be some pushback on that, and I think Jesus would be okay with that. What Jesus isn't doing here, Jesus isn't trying to say, all right, let's just do away with this law of Sabbath. Everybody work, have your soccer games, have all that. What Jesus is saying here is that there's some basic human needs that need to be met. And one of those is not only just eating, but the other is, and you look at the next story, is a connection to God. And, you know, you have this great healing story of Jesus taking the hand and, you know, stretching it out and seeing this healing happen at a time when it needed to happen. And that's one of the beliefs that, you know, when you believe, you know, it takes care of it in the Gospel of Mark. And I think that's, these two stories together point towards an act of practice. How are we practicing our faith? We can easily look at it, and are we being legalistic about our faith, which is unhealthy? Or are we looking at things in a practical sense and saying, you know, if someone comes up to you and says, hey, I need to eat, I can do that, you know, When someone comes up to us, or right now our church's financial situation, we just don't have money to give. But when it comes to finding food for people, we can do that, and I can find a meal for you.
Yeah.
But I can't, I don't have money just to, let me help you with your rent or your electrical bill or whatever, let me help you get a hotel room. And that breaks my heart, because I would love to be able to do that. But, the reality is that if we do that, then we'll have to reduce the salary of someone else. I mean, and so there's consequences of that. And so I think if we, as we look at this and we have our discussion, it's been interesting to think about how we practice the law, and how we, what is our interpretation as Pharisees who are questioning Jesus as a preacher, and saying, Jesus, what's your interpretation of the Sabbath that we've, kept for a long time? And Jesus kind of points out to the real reason of Sabbath.
Right. And he does that really well with chapter 3, into those first 6 verses of healing on the Sabbath. These same Pharisees are watching them, right? Like you say, we closely watch people with this legalism in mind of, are you going to do what you're supposed to do? Are you going to do what I think you need to do? And so they're watching Jesus closely. I feel like they're peering out windows and, behind haystacks. I don't know. That's just me. And he steps out to where people, or this man with this withered hand steps out to where people can see him. And Jesus asks, is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or to do evil, to save a life or to kill? And they say nothing. And he looks around angry, is what my translation says. And then he deeply grieves. That's deep. I mean, so much of what Jesus does is deep, but that tells you something about just who Jesus is.
And he's not grieving; he's grieving and the Common English translates it as unyielding hearts.
Right.
I mean, think about how often in our time, like in our churches, and you and I serve in a denomination, that part of our problem is the unyielding heart.
Right. We won't let it go. Right. We know the right answer. We know the answer to this is to do good, not to do evil, to save a life and not to kill. We know what the answer is there, but because we're so stuck in not letting this go, not letting the legalism go, we can't say anything. Right. And so Jesus heals the man's hand, and it pisses the Pharisees off. Right. They go and begin to plot against Jesus.
And what's funny is, like, in this gospel, we're only 3 chapters in, and Jesus is already picking people off. This is one of the reasons why I love this gospel, is because this gospel, like, from the very beginning, in the beginning of the gospel, we see this image of like God's coming and hitting the ground running, and he's doing it in a unique and new way that is going to transform the world. And man, you better be ready. And I take that to heart, because I think far too often, we're looking for a program, or we're looking for a ministry, when the real reality is that the Spirit catches you and takes you and takes off with you. If you let it. If you don't let it, then that's a whole other problem that we've got to deal with. But I really think, I mean, if when we look at this and we dive into this a little bit more, it's amazing to see that Jesus was willing just to, not necessarily like, if you notice, he's not fighting against the Pharisees. He's just pointing out that his interpretation is different. I mean, and it's not, it's not that it's a bad translation. He's not saying, Pharisees, you're bad, or Pharisees, you're wrong. He's just like, hey man, here's how I interpret it.
Right. Well, he's just asking the question, what do you do? Right.
Yeah.
Do you do good or evil? Do you save a life or kill on the Sabbath? I mean, what? That's as simple as it gets for him. It's just, what do you expect to do here, right?
Well, I like the response. So Jesus asked the question, is it legal on the Sabbath to do good or do evil, to save a life or to kill? But they said nothing. I mean, Jesus kind of like mic drops, and everybody's like, oh.
And that's the thing. Like I said, they know the answer, but they can't say it because then Jesus is right.
Yeah. This, I'm sure he didn't, I'm sure it's not one of those things where it's, just right there. I mean, I don't know. I'm a little bit speechless at this, looking at this and
Right.
thinking, here we are. I mean, how often do we act like this?
Right. Well, and that
to,
was my next question. How often are we Jesus in this story, and how often are we the Pharisees?
well, I think it's a balance. Well, I would hopefully say it's a balance of both, that you're not one or the other.
Right.
Because there are times where we have to be Pharisees, and some of that's to kind of have some sense of orthodoxy and orthopraxy that's healthy.
Right.
And I'm okay with that. And I think this is what Jesus is pointing out. It's not that your practice of the Sabbath is bad. It's just, hey, there are going to be times where you're going to have to bend the rules a little bit to do something that's good. And I think that's, when we wrestle with that, when we look at that there are going to be times where we're just going to have to bend a little, and it's not going to kill you.
Right.
And I think that's, I think as we think about our churches and stuff like that, is if we could, kind of get our churches to understand that, is that there are going to be times where we're going to have to bend a little. And there are times to bend and there are times not to bend. And I think when it comes to justice oriented issues, and you look at this man with a withered hand, who obviously needed some healing, and Jesus could see the need for healing, and healed him. He just, it's amazing to see like how we could just,
Well, it comes back to that idea that there are going to be times where being right is not as important as helping people, in doing the thing that is needed in the moment. And like you say, bending a little bit in places, and knowing when that is. And far too often, I think we get caught up in being right rather than actually seeing people. And that's where we fall into trouble as the church, as leaders, as a lot of things, is, oh, we're right. This is the right thing to do. And yet we have all of these people around us in search of healing. And, well, we can't, do that today because whatever reason. And, but we have to be right in that, instead of saying, oh, crap, you need food, you need healing, come here. We will be with you in these moments.
And so I think our question is this week, how do you practice the law?
That question sucks. That's a tough question. I mean, it really is.
And I think, but I think of it this way, and I said it. I think some of the times we have to be Pharisees, and we have to call out people that are not doing things that are healthy. And this is something that I've been thinking about, because I've just been wrestling with this ever since I got here more than anything. What does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ?
Right.
And so the thing that I've really discovered is that our general rules for the church is what it means to be a disciple of Jesus Christ. To do good, to do no harm, and to stay in love with God.
Right.
And there's going to be times when that stretches us. And there's going to be times when that gives us life. And I think, if someone asked me, Matt, what's a disciple of Jesus Christ? Well, it's someone that does good, does no harm, and stays in love with God.
Right.
And I think that that's extremely biblical. I think it's a healthy model, because here's the other thing. And this is the thing that I've really been wrestling with, thinking about this and thinking about, things that we're required to do in regards to the annual conference and stuff like that. Maybe we're complicating this process too much, like the Pharisees do.
100%.
And we're not being more Jesus about it and being practical. Jesus took the 10 Commandments and really kind of made them very practical.
Right.
And I think that when we look at what does it mean to be a disciple of Jesus Christ, Jesus did those three things. He did good, he did no harm, and he stayed in love with God.
Right.
And I think and just imagine if everybody in your church did 2 out of those 3 rules really well.
Right. Right. Well, and so that's the thing. I think you're absolutely spot on. We overcomplicate this, right? And I think it's in our human nature to say, well, how do we do this? How are we disciples of Jesus? And people want the 10 Commandments, right? They want 1 through 10 to say, well, if you pray, if you read Scripture, if you do this, and you do it at these times during the day, and you go to church on Sunday, and you go to church on Wednesday, that's what being a disciple is, right? and it becomes very cookie cutter and very over whatever. And yet it comes down to do good, do no harm, and stay in love with God. And that gives each disciple, each person, the freedom to say, this is who I am in Jesus. This is how I follow. And this is how I do good and do no harm. And this is how I stay in love with God. And it works for me. Instead of saying, well, did you read scripture today? Did you do this today? Well, if you didn't, then you didn't do it right. Well, there's not any freedom in that. There's not any grace in that. I don't think. I don't know. Maybe I'm wrong. But for each person, it's different, and there's not a formula that we can tell people to get it right. And so, yeah, we do overcomplicate it for sure, and look at these things in these ways that aren't life-giving. And so, yeah, I mean, that's a great question of how do we do this? How do we find that balance? And what's allowing you to do good, do no harm, and stay in love with God?
Yeah, I think if we do that, then I think that's a healthy thing.
I think so too.
And I would encourage our listeners to do that. And so, listeners, we want to encourage you to do that. Fire some feedback from us. We would love to be able to lift up some reviews on iTunes. And so, if you write a review, we may say your username on our thing. I think it'd be kind of fun to do. We may even read your review. So write some.
If you leave us a great review, we'll read it.
5 stars and a creative review. How about that? 5 stars and a creative review, and we'll read yours on a future podcast. How about that? That sounds like fun.
That does sound like fun.
And so we want to encourage you to go to our website, beardedtheologians.com. We're going to hopefully get back into the practice of having writing again. We kind of fell out of the practice of that, and some of that was just the time consuming of that. And we had a lot of our friends that were writing for us have had life changes, and that's been a little bit difficult for them. And so we're hoping to get back into the writing groove again. But we have some really great stuff up on our website. Some great podcasts. I mean, I think we have definitely hit our stride in regards to podcast gold in the last probably like 5 months. And so we'd encourage you to go back at least 5 months and listen. There's some really good stuff the last 5 months. Actually, the last year, we've had some phenomenal interviews, and we're going to hopefully have some more in the future. We're shooting for a couple of people that will be on that'll be fun. Our good friend Justin Coleman had a book come out. We're hoping to get him on soon. And so, just go on our website and check it out. And don't forget to buy a coffee mug or two. Father's Day is coming up. It'd be a great coffee mug. The meme challenge is still a go. And so I encourage you to lift that up. You have until really July 1st, maybe even later, depending on our schedules. And so we'll look at that and we'll make a decision there, but we're thankful for you, our listeners. And so don't forget to go on iTunes or Google Play and leave us a 5-star review, and then leave us a funny review, and we'll read your review on our future podcast. And so for the Bearded Theologians, I'm Matt Franks.
I'm Zach Bechtold. Thanks for checking us out.
We hope you've enjoyed the conversations that we've had today on the Bearded Theologians Beardcast, and we'd encourage you to continue those conversations online at beardedtheologians.com or on our Facebook page. We also hope that you pick up a couple of coffee mugs to satisfy your coffee mug collection. Have a good day.